Malik Carter had worked his entire life to afford this home. It wasn't just a house, it was proof that all his hard work had finally paid off. The neighborhood was upscale, quiet, and well-maintained. It was supposed to be a fresh start. But from the moment he pulled into his new driveway, he felt the weight of unwanted eyes on him. Across the street, a woman stood on her porch, arms crossed, lips pursed in clear disapproval. She was blonde, middle-aged, dressed in a crisp white blouse and a pencil skirt. Everything about her screamed authority, the kind that didn't like being questioned. Malik had seen her type before. He had barely stepped out of his car when she made her way over. "You lost?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake politeness. Malik glanced at her, confused. "No, I live here." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the very idea offended her. "Oh, I see." There was a pause just long enough for the tension to thicken. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. Malik exhaled slowly, shaking his head. First day here and already being treated like an outsider. He had dealt with this kind of passive-aggressive racism before. The type that didn't always come in words, but in looks, in tone, in the way people made sure you knew you didn't belong. He let it go. He had better things to do. The next morning, he stepped out of his house, keys in hand, ready to drive to work, only to find a car blocking his driveway. A rusted, dented, old-fashioned sedan, parked directly in the middle of his exit. Malik frowned. He looked around, but the street was mostly empty. He wasn't in the mood for drama, so he decided to ask around. A few knocks later, he got his answer. The woman from yesterday, the one who had looked at him like he was trespassing, opened her door, sipping coffee from a mug that read, HOA President Keeping Order, in gold cursive. "Morning," Malik said, keeping his voice polite. "Is that your car blocking my driveway?" She took a slow sip of her coffee, looking him over. Then, with a smirk, she said, "It is." Malik blinked. He had expected an apology, maybe some excuse about not realizing. Instead, she was just smirking at him like she was daring him to challenge her. "Would you mind moving it?" he asked, still keeping his voice even. Karen took another sip. "No." The bluntness of it threw him off. "Excuse me? I said no." She scrolled through her phone, acting completely unbothered. "I'm teaching you a lesson." Or Malik felt his jaw tighten. "A lesson in what?" Karen finally looked up, her smirk widening. "In how things work around here." There it was. She wasn't just blocking his driveway, she was making a statement. Malik clenched his fists, inhaling deeply through his nose. He had seen people like her pull this nonsense before, playing their little power games. This was about control, about showing him who really ran things here. "You know this is illegal, right?" he said, forcing himself to stay calm. Karen let out a fake laugh. "Oh, sweetie, maybe you should read the HOA regulations." She held up a clipboard, tapping the pages with a manicured finger. "This street has community easement rights, which means technically that driveway isn't just yours. It's part of shared neighborhood property." Malik stared at her. "So you're saying you can just park there whenever you want?" Karen beamed. "Exactly." Malik let out a slow breath, willing himself not to snap. She was baiting him. She wanted a reaction. "All right," he said, stepping back. "I'll handle this another way." Karen tilted her head. "Oh, gonna call the cops?" She feigned concern. "Because just so you know, my husband's a lawyer, and I'd hate for you to get into any trouble over a misunderstanding." Malik met her eyes. She was daring him, testing how far she could push. He turned away, pulling out his phone. "I'll let the HOA handle it." Karen laughed. "Oh, sweetheart, I am the HOA." That's when Malik understood. This wasn't just some petty neighbor drama. This was a power move, a warning. He wasn't going to win this fight by playing nice. But Karen had no idea who she was messing with. The next morning, Malik stepped outside to grab his newspaper, only to find a bright yellow envelope taped to his front door. HOA notice. His stomach clenched. He already had a feeling who was behind this. Sure enough, as he peeled the notice open, Bold letters glared back at him. Malik frowned. Improper disposal? His trash bins had been placed out exactly as required. He knew because he had checked the HOA rules before moving in. He scanned the fine print. Trash bin was placed on the curb at 6:58 a.m. HOA regulations state bins may only be placed at 7 a.m. Malik felt his jaw tighten. 2 minutes. They fined him for being 2 damn minutes early. From across the street, he heard a familiar voice. Problem? He turned to see Karen standing smugly on her porch, sipping her morning coffee. Malik held up the notice. You fined me over 2 minutes? Karen's eyes twinkled with faux sympathy. Rules are rules, sweetheart. If we let one person break them, where do we draw the line? Malik clenched his fist but forced himself to stay calm. She was testing him. Again. He exhaled, shoving the paper into his pocket. All right, he muttered. He'd let this one go. But it didn't stop there. Another notice. This time, grass exceeding approved length warning issued. Malik knelt down and ran his fingers through his lawn. It wasn't even overgrown. He measured it just to be sure. 0.5 inches above HOA's so-called standard. Meanwhile, he looked around at his neighbors' yards. Half of them had taller grass than his, yet no warning signs on their doors. When he called the HOA office to ask why he was singled out, he got a dry response. We only enforce violations as they are reported. Malik didn't need to guess who had reported him. Malik was heading to work when he noticed another note on his windshield. Your vehicle's color is not in compliance with HOA aesthetic standards. He stared at the letter in disbelief. Karen was now coming after his car. His black car. Malik gritted his teeth looking around. Multiple other cars in the neighborhood were darker shades, navy blue, dark gray, even a deep maroon. But somehow only his was an aesthetic violation. He spotted Karen watching from her porch, pretending to be on her phone, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. Malik walked over, holding up the letter. Seriously? My car violates HOA standards? Karen didn't even look up. Unfortunately, black doesn't fit the approved palette for vehicles parked in visible areas. Malik huffed a humorless laugh. Then why do half the people here have dark-colored cars? Karen finally met his gaze and her smirk widened. Well, Malik, not everyone is you. There it was, the truth, hidden behind a thin veil of HOA bureaucracy. One evening, Malik returned home from work, exhausted, only to find his driveway blocked. Again. But this time it wasn't Karen's car. It was an HOA construction sign. Yeah. Malik's stomach twisted as he read the words printed in bold. Community Beautification Project Driveway, access temporarily restricted. What the hell, he muttered under his breath. His driveway? Out of all the houses here? As if on cue, Karen strolled up, clipboard in hand. Evening, she said sweetly. Oh, I see you noticed the new project. We're installing new decorative lighting for the neighborhood entrance. And unfortunately, we had to use your driveway as a temporary work zone. Malik's blood boiled. And you didn't think to inform me first? Karen let out a fake sigh. Oh, I assumed you got the notice. We sent it out this morning. Malik clenched his fists. Move the damn sign. Karen's eyes glinted with amusement. Oh, Malik, I'd be careful with that attitude. Wouldn't want to come across as threatening. Threatening. There it was, the word every black man dreaded hearing. Karen didn't just want to harass him. She wanted to paint him as the problem. Before Malik could respond, a police car pulled up. His stomach dropped. A white officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he walked over. Everything all right here? Karen's voice immediately shifted into fake distress. Oh, officer, I was just trying to explain to Malik here about the construction, and, well, he's getting a little aggressive. Malik stared at her, barely able to believe what he was hearing. The officer turned to him, giving him a once-over. That look, the kind that said, I'm already assuming you're the problem. Sir, let's not escalate things, the officer said, voice calm but firm. Malik's hands balled into fists. He hadn't done anything, but he knew better than to argue. He took a slow breath, forcing his voice steady. I just want access to my driveway, the officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. Look, I suggest you take this up with the HOA. This is a civil matter. Karen's smirk returned. Malik knew what had just happened. She had won this round, but she had no idea who she was playing with. That night, as Malik sat at his desk, staring at the HOA rulebook, he knew one thing for sure. It was time to fight back. It had been 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Malik waking up to bogus fines, ridiculous HOA notices, and Karen's smug face watching from her porch every time he left his house. But this was the final straw. Malik stepped out of his house one morning, ready to go to work, only to stop dead in his tracks. Karen's car was parked in his driveway, not slightly on the edge, dead center, as if she was daring him to do something about it. Malik took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. His hands curled into fists before he exhaled and walked over to her house. He knocked, hard. It took a few moments before Karen opened the door, her usual smug expression already in place. "Morning, Malik," she said sweetly, sipping from her ridiculous HOA Boss Babe coffee mug. Daring him to do something about it. Malik took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. His hands curled into fists before he exhaled and walked over to her house. He knocked, hard. It took a few moments before Karen opened the door, her usual smug expression already in place. "Morning, Malik," she said sweetly, sipping from her ridiculous HOA Boss Babe coffee mug. Malik ignored the fake pleasantries. "Move your car." Karen took a slow sip of her coffee, tilting her head. "Oh, is that bothering you?" Malik's jaw clenched. "Yes, you're blocking my driveway." Karen smiled, her eyes glinting with amusement. She wanted this fight. "You don't own this neighborhood, sweetheart," she said smoothly. "You don't get to make the rules here." Malik felt his patience snap like a rubber band stretched too tight. "Move your damn car." Karen let out a dramatic gasp, clutching her chest like she had just been struck. "Oh my, are you threatening me?" Malik took a step back, realizing too late what she was doing. "That's it," he muttered. He pulled out his phone and dialed the police. Karen's expression didn't falter. In fact, her smirk grew wider, like she had been waiting for this moment. A white officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. "What's the issue here?" Malik kept his voice steady. "She's parked in my driveway and refusing to move." Before the officer could respond, Karen let out a loud, shaky breath. And then, the crocodile tears began. "I was so scared," she whispered, voice trembling. He came to my door, banging so aggressively. He was shouting at me." Malik's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's a lie!" Karen's hands shook as she wiped her fake tears. I just parked there for a second while I was getting something from my house. I didn't mean any harm, but the way he yelled at me, officer, I didn't feel safe." The officer's expression shifted. Malik knew that look. He had seen it too many times before. "Sir," the officer said, turning to Malik, "I'm going to need you to calm down." Malik forced himself to unclench his fists. "I am calm," he said, his voice dangerously close to breaking. "She's the one breaking the law." Karen sniffled. "I just don't understand why he's so aggressive. I was just trying to explain the HOA rules to him." The officer sighed, glancing between them. Then, to Malik's disbelief, he said, "This is a civil matter. I suggest you take it up with the HOA." Malik took a slow breath. "So you're not going to do anything?" The officer gave him a warning look. "I am doing something. I'm telling you to de-escalate the situation." De-escalate? Malik was the one being harassed. He was the one being provoked. But in the officer's eyes, he was already the aggressor. Karen knew it too. She stood there, her arms crossed, watching Malik lose. His blood boiled as the officer turned to leave. Malik watched as Karen let out a dramatic sigh and strolled over to her car. With a smirk, she climbed in, started the engine, and, at the slowest possible speed, backed out of his driveway. As she drove off, she rolled down her window just enough to murmur, "Careful, Malik. You wouldn't want to get a reputation now, would you?" And then she was gone. That night, Malik didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at his laptop, HOA rulebooks open in front of him. He was done playing fair. If Karen wanted to use the law against him, he was going to find a way to use it against her. For hours, he scrolled through zoning regulations, legal loopholes, and county property laws. He was exhausted, his head pounding, but then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., ***, he found it. A single paragraph buried deep in the county zoning codes. A loophole. One that would change everything. Malik leaned back in his chair, reading it over and over, a slow grin stretching across his face. Karen had no idea what was coming. Malik stared at the screen, reading the words over and over to make sure he wasn't imagining them. Private residential driveways may be repurposed as personal helipads upon obtaining appropriate permits. At that point, they will be considered aviation property and subject to FAA regulations rather than local HOA ordinances. His heart pounded. This was it. A loophole buried deep in the county zoning laws, one that could completely override the HOA's authority. Karen had spent weeks throwing her weight around, using HOA rules as a weapon. But she had made one critical mistake, assuming those rules were the highest law in the land. They weren't. Malik quickly pulled up the FAA website and skimmed through the requirements. The process wasn't even that complicated. He just needed to submit an application, provide a safety inspection report, and register the location as a private-use helipad. By morning, the paperwork was already filed. By noon, the FAA had responded. And within 48 hours, an inspector arrived. The HOA could fine him for trash cans, grass length, and car colors, but they couldn't stop the Federal Aviation Administration. 2 days later, Malik stepped outside with a bucket of bright yellow paint. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. With careful precision, he began painting FAA-approved helipad markings right on his driveway. Large H in the center, directional arrows, border lines. Every brush stroke was a middle finger to Karen. He was halfway through when he heard the screeching. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Malik didn't even flinch. Right on cue. Karen stormed across the street, her heels clicking against the pavement, clipboard in hand. She looked outraged. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "This is against HOA rules." Malik calmly dipped his brush into the paint. "Actually, it's not." Karen's face turned red. "Driveways are for vehicles, not—" She waved her hands in frustration. "Whatever this is." Malik finally turned to her, his lips curling into a smirk, the moment he had been waiting for. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a stack of official FAA-approved documents. "HOA rules don't apply to federal aviation zones, sweetheart." Karen snatched the papers, scanning them frantically, her eyes widening as she read. Her hands started to shake. "This," she stammered, "this isn't real. This can't be real." Malik crossed his arms. "Oh, it's real." Karen's mouth opened and closed, struggling for words. You can't just turn your driveway into a helipad." Malik tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because," Karen sputtered. "That's insane." Malik grinned. "Is it? Or is it just legal?" Karen's fingers crumpled the paper slightly as she tightened her grip. You can't just—" Malik leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough. "I did." The look on Karen's face was priceless. For the first time since he moved in, she looked genuinely speechless. She let out a frustrated growl and stormed off, muttering under her breath. Malik simply smiled and got back to painting. But he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Karen was losing it. Malik could tell from the way she paced in front of the HOA office, phone clutched in one hand, her clipboard practically digging into her palm. She was making calls, a lot of them. Malik didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. She was scrambling for a way to shut him down. And sure enough, 2 days later, A notice was slipped under his door. Urgent. HOA board meeting violation hearing. Malik smirked. Here we go. The meeting was packed. More people than usual. Homeowners, board members, even a few unfamiliar faces, some likely there just for the drama. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression ice cold as she adjusted the microphone. Let's get straight to business, she announced. We are here to discuss the unauthorized and highly inappropriate modifications made by Mr. Malik Carter. She turned to him, her voice dripping with fake concern. Malik, she sighed, we've tried to be understanding, but this is unacceptable. Malik leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Unacceptable how? Karen shot a look at the board members, then gestured dramatically toward the projector screen. A photo of his helipad markings flashed into the display. This, she said, voice sharp, is a direct violation of our HOA aesthetic guidelines. Murmurs spread through the room. Malik stayed silent. Let her dig her own grave. Karen continued. This disrupts the beauty of our neighborhood. It poses a safety risk. And worst of all, she slammed her palm on the table. It was done without HOA approval. She sat back triumphant. Malik exhaled slowly. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his bag and pulled out a stack of FAA-certified documents. Aren't you, Karen, he said, his voice calm. You keep talking about HOA approval. He slid the papers across the table. You forgot to mention something. Karen frowned, hesitating before grabbing the papers. As she read, her face drained of color. HOA rules don't apply to FAA-regulated zones, Malik said smoothly. This is federal aviation property now. A hush fell over the room. Karen's hands trembled slightly. That doesn't make sense. Malik shrugged. Take it up with the government. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, murmuring amongst themselves. Karen looked trapped, and Malik wasn't done. You want to talk about violations? He continued. How about the targeted harassment fines I've been receiving? The fake driveway construction project? The HOA's blatant racial discrimination? The murmurs grew louder. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a voice from the back of the room called out, Is it true that you reported Malik's car for being the wrong color? Heads turned. A man with a press badge stood near the entrance, a camera slung around his shoulder. A reporter. Karen's expression froze. Is it true, the reporter continued, stepping forward, that HOA regulations have been selectively enforced against Malik Carter? A woman near the front scoffed. I live 3 doors down, and I've had dark-colored cars for years. I've never gotten a violation notice. A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. Karen gritted her teeth. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped. But it was too late. She had lost control. That night, Malik was inside his house relaxing with a cup of tea when his security app buzzed. Motion detected driveway. He checked the feed, and what he saw nearly made him laugh out loud. Karen. She was standing in his driveway, a bucket of paint in her hands. Malik watched, amused, as she furiously splashed black paint over his freshly marked helipad. She stomped around, smearing the bright yellow lines, huffing and puffing like a cartoon villain. Malik sighed. She really was that predictable. He let her finish. Let her dig her grave just a little deeper. Then he stepped outside. Karen turned, startled, caught red-handed. You just destroyed federal aviation markings, Karen. Malik's voice was calm, almost bored. Karen froze. That's not, she started. Malik held up his phone, security footage playing in crystal clear detail. Karen paled. You wouldn't, she whispered. Malik smiled. Oh, I absolutely would. And with that, he dialed the authorities. Karen stood frozen, her hands stained with black paint, eyes darting between Malik and the phone in his hand. You wouldn't, she repeated, but her voice was shaking now. Malik arched an eyebrow. You destroyed federal property, Karen. That's a felony. She panicked. Instead of responding, she grabbed her own phone and frantically dialed 911. Yes, I need officers here immediately, she practically screamed. He, he's threatening me. Malik let out a slow, amused breath. The audacity. Within minutes, a police car pulled up, sirens blaring. Karen ran towards the officers like she had just escaped a crime scene. There, she pointed at Malik. Arrest him! The officer sighed, already tired. For what, ma'am? Karen's mouth opened and closed, searching for a lie that would stick. He's illegally marking up his driveway. He threatened me. He's ruining our neighborhood. Malik stayed calm, arms crossed. Officers, I'd like you to meet FAA Regulation 14 CFR Part 157. He handed them his FAA-approved paperwork. The officers skimmed through the documents, then exchanged a look. Ma'am, one officer said slowly, turning to Karen, this property is legally designated as a private-use helipad. Karen's face went pale. The other officer held up Malik's phone. And we have footage of you vandalizing it. Karen's eyes went wild. I was just cleaning up the mess, she blurted out. With black paint? Malik asked, smirking. The officers weren't buying it. Ma'am, you're under investigation for tampering with federal aviation property. That's a serious offense. Karen took a step back. No, this isn't fair. But for once, her tears didn't work. The officer stepped aside as another, official-looking car pulled up. FAA inspectors. A middle-aged man in a suit approached Malik. Mr. Carter? Malik nodded. We reviewed your complaint, the inspector said, glancing at Karen. Given the evidence, she's looking at fines and possible legal consequences. Karen's mouth fell open. The inspector continued, completely ignoring her. Your property remains officially recognized as an FAA-regulated helipad. The HOA has no authority here. Karen let out a strangled gasp, her face turning an unnatural shade of purple. She had lost. The news spread like wildfire. By the next morning, HOA board members were distancing themselves from Karen. Some homeowners who had stayed silent before started questioning the HOA's strict policies. And then, the grand moment came. Helicopter day. Malik had scheduled a one-time test landing for his helipad, and the entire neighborhood knew about it. People gathered on sidewalks, phones out, waiting. Karen, standing with her usual posse of HOA loyalists, was fuming. This is ridiculous, she hissed. We can't allow this. No one was listening. Then it happened. A deep, rumbling roar filled the air. People's heads snapped upward as the unmistakable thrum of rotor blades echoed across the neighborhood. The helicopter came into view, circling once before descending. The wind force sent leaves scattering, rattling windows. Karen's hair whipped wildly around her face. She was screaming something, but no one could hear her. The helicopter touched down perfectly in the middle of Malik's freshly marked helipad. The pilot waved, gave Malik a thumbs up, then, for added effect, popped open a soda and took a sip. Malik turned, smiling. Still think it's not a helipad, Karen? Karen was shaking with rage. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You! Malik held up his phone. All legal, all recorded. The crowd cheered, Karen's hands fisted at her sides. She turned on her heel and stormed off, shoving past people, her entire reign of terror crumbling in real time. For the first time since moving in, Malik felt something incredible. Freedom. Karen's hands fisted at her sides. She turned on her heel and stormed off, shoving past people, her entire reign of terror crumbling in real time. For the first time since moving in, Malik felt something incredible. Freedom. Karen had lost, and the whole neighborhood knew it. Within 24 hours of the helicopter landing, the HOA board called for an emergency meeting, but this time Karen wasn't leading it. She sat at the far end of the table, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight it looked like she was grinding her teeth into dust. The new acting chairperson, an older man named Tom Richards, cleared his throat. Given recent events, he said, glancing toward Karen, we have reason to believe that HOA policies have been enforced in a biased and discriminatory manner. A murmur spread through the room. Karen sat up straighter. Excuse me, she snapped. I have always acted in the best interest of this neighborhood. Tom ignored her. Furthermore, he continued, several financial inconsistencies have come to our attention. HOA funds were used for unauthorized purposes, including personal expenses. Karen's face went pale. What? She screeched. That's a lie. But the board members weren't listening. One by one, they voted. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. A wave of satisfaction rolled through Malik as he watched her entire empire crumble. The fallout was immediate. Without her HOA power trip, Karen became a neighborhood joke. People openly defied the ridiculous rules she had enforced. A neighbor painted his house bright yellow. Another homeowner threw a loud barbecue party right in the middle of what used to be Karen's quiet hours. A woman planted colorful flowers in her front yard, flowers Karen had banned for not fitting the aesthetic. Karen tried to fight back. She filed complaints. She tried to hold an unofficial HOA meeting. No one showed up. She had lost her grip completely. Then came the final blow. The news coverage of Malik's Helipad battle went viral. Karen became a national laughingstock. Memes flooded the internet. People started calling her Helipad Karen. Her reputation? Destroyed. She couldn't go to the grocery store without getting side eyes. She couldn't show her face at community events without whispers following her. Karen snapped. Within a week, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. A few months later, Malik stepped outside, a cup of coffee in hand, and let out a deep breath. The neighborhood felt different now. For the first time since he moved in, he wasn't being watched, wasn't being targeted. Across the street, a moving truck was parked outside Karen's old house. A black family was unloading boxes. Malik smiled to himself. Poetic justice. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. Hey, brother. Malik turned to see Tom Richards, the new HOA president, walking over. Tom extended a hand. You did the right thing, brother. Malik shook it, nodding. For the first time since I moved in, Malik said, this neighborhood finally feels like home.